deficits. So let's get back to the limbic system. Paul MacLean wrote about the triune brain, which has been criticized in part, but I think provides a nice, simplified look at evolution of the brain. And he describes three levels: the reptilian brain, the limbic brain, or paleo-mammalian brain, very early mammalian brain, and then the later mammalian brain, which is the neocortex. And a much more powerful analogy comes from a gentleman, Dr. Ullman, who is a neurobiologist at Caltech, who, if anyone here is interested in brain evolution, his book called Evolving Minds is just a beautiful and lovely book. I think I've read it cover to cover no less than 4 times, just because it's so easy to read. The pictures are beautiful, and he makes wonderful analogies. But here's one of my favorite ones, which has now been quoted by a lot of people from Orrin. But he said he was once visiting a power plant in some inner city building, and he went down to the guts of the power plant in the basement and was blown away to see that there were pneumatic controls, vacuum tubes from the 40s and 50s, and multiple generations of computers. And he looked at the person and he said, "What is going on here? You know, pneumatic controls, this is from like early 1900s, vacuum tubes, this was like, you know, when RTA was born or something, you know, what are these things doing in a power plant in 1995? And the answer was, well, this power plant's been in continuous operation since like 1900. We've never shut down. We've never had like shut down for a week and just upgrade the system. So we've always had to keep the old systems going and add on new systems to them. And that's exactly what the brain is. So with brain evolution, we never had, you know, evolution never had a chance to say, this is not the optimal design, let's toss the organism away and let's come up with an ideal solution to this environmental niche and amount of cortex we have and energy consumption. What the brain has had to do is have older systems that keep getting layered on top of, with newer systems on top of the older systems. And again, I think it's the same metaphor or analogy that I offered earlier for how we think of humans. You know, we don't think of ourselves as the same animal as the men and women who were here 50,000 years ago, who, you know, may have had a little bit of cloth covering themselves if they were lucky, but were basically, you know, unrecognizable. When Darwin went to Tierra del Fuego on the Beagle voyage, he said that, you know, he couldn't believe these people were the same species that he was. And when he wrote in The Descent of Man, 12 years after the Origin was published in 1959, the Beagle was much before then, and he basically said a horrific thing, and this is from, you know, the messiah of biology, the guy who saw more and saw more out of the box than any human being has ever seen in biology. He said, you know, that there are, among the evolution of man, there's, you know, white men, there's black men, and gorillas, and then you've got, you know, monkeys below. So gorillas and blacks were kind of somewhere between whites and monkeys. And that was how Darwin formulated human evolution. He couldn't have been any more wrong. We are derived from black. We're all black once upon a time. But our genetic differences are totally trivial. And when you go back 50,000 years, you know, we were animals that were not so terribly distinguishable. I mean, we had language functions, which we don't know exactly what they were. They're probably very similar. There's very little doubt, because this experiment was done for Darwin, and he couldn't get it regardless. When Captain Fitzroy, the first captain of the Beagle, on a voyage I think about 3 years before, committed suicide, and Fitzroy was the first officer and took over. And when Fitzroy went to Tierra del Fuego to do some geographic mappings of the coastline, one of the small boats from the Beagle was stolen by some of the natives. And so to retaliate, he captured 3 individuals who he thought were relatives of the thieves, but he had no idea whether they were or weren't. And then it became inconvenient to put them back, and they never got the boat back. It became inconvenient to put them back on shore, the Fuegians. So he took them and said, I'll take them to England and give them a good Christian education. And they actually bought another boy for a button. They traded a pearl button for a boy and brought 4 people back. One died of smallpox shortly after they got back to England. And the other 3 were educated at a church primary school just outside of London. They became highlights in society. They had visits with the Queen and the King. Parties were set up so people could meet them. And they became very polite, said, "Thank you, ma'am," and drank tea and learned how to sit properly. The problem occurred for Fitzroy when the 26-year-old male developed a strong sexual passion for the 9-year-old girl. And that was something Victorian society was going to have a lot of problems with, and may well have led to the need to do the second Beagle voyage as quickly as it was done. And that is to get these Fuegians back to Tierra del Fuego so he didn't lose his command in the British Navy. And that's when Darwin he was afraid of being stuck on the boat with salty sea dogs and some savages from Tierra del Fuego. So he looked to find someone who could keep him company, and that was how Darwin got the trip on the Beagle. But so Darwin got to spend time with the 3 Fuegians on the Beagle, and was, incredibly amazed at how fluent and perfect their English was. Their vision was much better than any Englishman. They could see ships way further out, or things way further out than any of the English sailors could see. So their eyesight, for whatever reason, was much better developed than the English. However, when they got back to put the 3 people back with their family members, Darwin wrote in his journals that of all the things he saw on his Beagle voyage, this was the most shocking and amazing of all. And that was how savage the people of Tierra del Fuego were, that he said no lower version of man can exist on the planet. So here's Darwin on the Beagle voyage, who sees that you can take savages, bring them to England for 2 years, have them become perfectly civilized, and yet when he goes back and meets the savages' families, he thinks it's all genetic, that they are somewhere way below the evolutionary rung of humans. So there's no doubt if anyone in this room was born to a hunter-gatherer population 50,000 years ago, we would be savages who make the Fuegians look civilized. And there's no doubt if one of the people from 50,000 years ago was a newborn, born at Mount Sinai Hospital or Lenox Hill and taken home by some parents, that they would be probably unrecognizable as any intelligent modern member of society. We are those same people, and we are who we are in today's world because of the cultural changes of the last 50,000 years, not because of any genetic changes. And one could actually fairly strongly argue that the genetic changes that have occurred may well have largely been negative ones, things like male color blindness. You don't find that in primates. If you're a primate, you can't tolerate being colorblind because you can't find ripe fruit. You can't recognize subtle changes in facial expression of other males or females that may indicate aggression or reproductive opportunities. It's selected against very heavily to be colorblind in the wild. But in human males, in our world, colorblindness is terribly prevalent because it doesn't matter if you're colorblind. You can get around it. If you can't tell the lights, you figure out which one is on top of the other one. There's 50 ways around colorblindness in today's world. So if anything, our genes have probably slipped in certain areas that we can easily quantify that are not present in wild populations. So one can argue that the people 50,000 years ago may have been a richer and better genetic stock than we are. But again, evolution's a good lesson. So coming back to epilepsy, keep circling back. I want to get back to this issue of exhaustion, inhibition, and excitation. Post-ictal hemiplegia, what's better known as Todds paralysis now, was first described by Bravais in 1827. Todd got the credit 28 years later. But basically said generally it's a side that's paralyzed, which had alone been convulsed, and it resulted from exhaustion of brain tissue. More severe seizures, the greater the weakness. Robertson and Jackson endorsed this theory. It seemed like it made good sense. And then Gowers came along in 1881 and said, no, and that may account for some cases of Todd's paralysis, but it certainly can't account for all. In part, we know that some seizures are very mild, and the weakness is very profound, or the seizure is very severe, and the weakness is very mild. In addition, there were cases that were described by Jackson where actually you could arrest a seizure with a ligature And then afterwards, even though the seizure was arrested, the post-ictal paralysis would be much more intense. So there's a lot of dissociations here, and it just wasn't clear. So again, the issue of inhibition not only during a seizure, but after a seizure is also very important. When we come back to those different periods and they blend together, so before seizures, people can describe headache and irritability, which can also occur hours or days before a seizure, and often right after a seizure. Automatisms, things like lip smacking and swallowing movements that we all know in complex partial seizures are very common. Most neurologists, I think if you said to the average neurologist, what's the cause of automatisms, they'd say, well, you stimulate temporal lobe tissue and you get automatism. That's wrong. What happens is, yeah, the temporal lobe tissue may be stimulated and discharging, but automatisms are released in the brainstem. Those mouth movements you can get by stimulating the central brain of the midbrain. So they are central pattern generators, which are well known in motor physiology, deep in the brainstem that can be, and hypothalamic regions that can be activated. They're probably a release, not a direct activation. And then there are all the cognitive and behavioral issues, again, that blur between both post-ictal and interictal states and are probably a continuous fusion. Familiarity is something that I promised I'd get back to. And the perirhinal cortex, which is the anterior parahippocampal gyrus, is a part of the brain that's critical for familiarity of faces and objects. There's a patient who was described who had a temporal resection of the left perirhinal cortex for epilepsy, which spared the hippocampus, and that person had impaired familiarity but preserved recollection. And there are a lot of fMRI studies that exactly duplicate this point, that the perirhinal cortex gets activated with familiarity, whereas the hippocampus gets activated during recollection. And it's the posterior parahippocampal gyrus that is critical for familiarity of places. So again, faces and places are biologically critical issues. We come to familiarity with deja vu, one of the symptoms Dr. Z described. I think we all know it, what it is. About 70% of the general population has had it. It occurs much more frequently with right than left temporal lobe foci. And interestingly, when you can do MEG recordings, when the stimulus is seen for a second time, it's not activation, but it's actually suppression. So perirhinal cortex is truly activated by novelty and suppressed by familiarity. The brain recognizes those two signals, and they're critical. There's a syndrome which kind of came into my lap called hyperfamiliarity with faces, which is not well recognized. But when I saw it, I think there were only 4 cases reported, 3 modern and 1 by Kreplin back about 100 years ago. This first case was reported by Bill Muir in a Brain article, a woman with a left lateral temporal infarct who developed a tonic-clonic seizure and then became post-apagnotic only for unfamiliar faces, which is a way to say that she thought everybody was familiar. Janitors, strangers on the street, everybody. And it was a very unusual symptom. She wasn't delusional. Once you said to her, you know, she'd come up to you on the street, and you said, no, I don't know you. She'd say, oh, I'm sorry, I do this sometimes. Patient 2 was a man who had bilateral frontal lobe epilepsy, described by Mike Sperling and his colleagues, who had a cluster of like 12 complex partial seizures, and is what probably is a Todds paralysis, a post-ictal state lasting 2 days. Again, the same thing when a new nurse would come by. Where do I know you from? You don't know me. It's my first shift, and I don't think you were here when I was here 2 days ago. So again, just not understanding who is unfamiliar, unable to get that information. Patient 3 was the patient who walked into my office, a very lovely man, a policeman, who had had deja vu and fear for 6 months, which went, unpresented to doctors, and then he had a complex partial seizure, and later the day, a tonic-clonic seizure, and of course got to an emergency room, and got treated with Dilantin, and saw me a week later. I converted him over to lamotrigine. And then he came back a month later, and I said, how you doing? He goes, fine. Any seizures? No, he actually did have a couple of words after that, but he goes, I gotta tell you the weirdest thing, Doc. I said, what? He goes, I keep thinking I know everybody. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, there was a fundraiser for a kid with cancer in my community. Like 600 people. I probably knew like 100 of them or something. But I just kept walking up to everybody. I was convinced I knew them. I didn't know where I knew them from, but I just knew I knew that face. And about 2 weeks later, there was a football game. He's in a predominantly Irish Catholic town, and their football team was playing an almost all-black town. And during the first half, he just all of a sudden got up and walked over during the middle of the game and went up to the black coach of the other team and said, "Where do I know you from?" And the black coach basically told him to get the hell out of there. And then everyone on his side said, "What the, what were you thinking?" And he said, "I just felt like I knew the guy." And again, he's a bright guy, and he says, once people tell me that they don't know me, I understand that I'm making this mistake again, but I get this incredible feeling like I do know them, and I just feel like I just have to find out. And he's had this as a continuous symptom now for going on 2 years. I don't think we understand it at all, but obviously something related. He gets deja vu. We know you can get that from perirhinal cortex activation. So there are actually 7 patients that I was able to find. I found a few more in my own practice. All had tonic-clonic seizures or epilepsy. I suspect this occurs in other places as well. It's just Alzheimer's, I bet it occurs. Oliver Sacks said his father probably had this at the very end. Most have left hemisphere or bilateral temporal lobe pathology. And deja vu and hyperfamiliarity for faces, I think, may occur with a relative increase in right relative to left medial temporal activity. So hyperfamiliarity for faces occurs with left brain injury, whereas deja vu occurs with right brain activation more often. And that's consistent with what's been written a lot of. Giannotti wrote a beautiful review with the right temporal lobe dominance, not exclusive, but dominance for familiarity experiences, whether they be for faces or places. Topographic orientation is more of a right hemisphere. Facial recognition is more of a right hemisphere. And the emotion of familiarity, the experience of familiarity, is probably a right hemisphere dominant activity. So another area of interest for me is what's going on with delusions. And again, I'm not going to get into the ones that occur in schizophrenia, but the ones that occur in neurologic illness. And what you see is if you take a large number of patients with delusions that follow, obviously Alzheimer's, you get lesions everywhere, or widespread on both sides. But if you get a stroke or a brain tumor or a head injury that affects one side of the brain predominantly, delusions such as cataracts occur about 75 or 80% or more of the time with right-sided brain lesions. So it seems to be right hemisphere pathology is very strongly correlated with a whole variety of delusions, whether it's about somatic body, there's a whole bunch of olfactory reference syndrome. There's tons of delusional disorders that can occur with brain injuries, cataracts probably being the most famous, but they're usually right hemisphere lesions. And some of the things that you see with right hemisphere lesions alter reality, self-recognition, emotional familiarity that we talked about, ego boundaries. So Boguslavsky in Switzerland described a group of patients. I think it's a beautiful thing. You all kind of probably have seen this, but you go into a 2-bedded room where a curtain's pulled, and you go to examine patient in bed 2, and you say to the patient, "Okay, I'm going to do some tests, and hold up both arms and spread your fingers wide apart," and the patient next door starts doing it. They don't get the ego boundary that you're examining bed 2, and you're really not asking them to do these things, or you ask them to repeat a phrase, and the people there repeat it. They all 12 of those patients had right hemisphere lesions. The ability to know about self, your own recognition of face activates right hemisphere regions much more than left. So when you have right hemisphere lesions, there's a disruption between the monitoring of mental, emotional, and corporeal senses of self relative to people, places, and even your own body parts. And so what I would argue happens with delusions is, it's right hemisphere pathology, often combined in many cases with frontal lobe injuries bilaterally or on the right side alone, that really impair self-monitoring and error detection and correction. But it's not the right hemisphere that causes the delusions. Again, you get seduced into seeing the lesion there. It's the left hemisphere that's causing the problems. So when Gazzaniga, who's done a lot of split brain studies with calosotomy patients, when he looks at them, the hemisphere that lies is the left hemisphere. You show someone, a naked picture to the right hemisphere, and they smile and they giggle, and you say, "Why are you smiling?" "Oh, for no reason." "Oh, come on, you just smiled and giggled after I showed you a picture." And they'll just make up a story. There's a famous, showing someone a chicken leg on one side and a snow shovel on the other, and then showing them a snow scene. And they'll start talking about, what are these things there for, and they'll start making up a lie, incorporating, what they see in front of them, come up with you showed me pictures of a chicken coop, and you need the shovel to shovel the chicken coop, and not having realized that they saw snow in the shovel. But they just will immediately lie without any hesitation. And I think essentially when you get something like cat breaths, where I described my grandmother who had this at the very end, who probably had both a multi-infarct and Alzheimer's, she confused Charlie, her live-in boyfriend for 7 years, with an imposter, because I think she recognized the face as familiar, and she recognized the face as Charlie. So the fusiform gyrus knew that it was Charlie, but she didn't get the glow of emotional familiarity that was always associated with Charlie in the past. Something either happened to impair that area of the right temporal lobe, so she didn't get the familiarity experience, or disconnected those areas, as Ramachandran has speculated. But the problem is the left hemisphere got disinhibited. And what is the left hemisphere is good at? It's good at analysis. As Steve Coslin, chair of psychology at Harvard, said, it is the dichotomous hemisphere. It's very good at categorical things. Again, some of our generalizations that the right hemisphere is visual spatial and the left hemisphere is verbal are way too reductionistic and simple. The right hemisphere, yeah, it's good at visual spatial, but if you give someone a task of Milwaukee and Chicago, which one's north and south, or east and west, or up and down, when it's a binomial category, the left hemisphere, even for spatial things, does much better than the right. The left hemisphere thinks in categorical A or B, yes or no ways. And so you get this paradox. You have a face of someone you've known your whole life, or for 7 years, very intimately, and that's what CAPRES usually affects, is intimate relations. You don't get the familiarity, and then you get the left hemisphere left to its own without error detection, without self-monitoring, and it has a dichotomous solution. Yeah, I've got a face that's very familiar, but I know it's not that person because they don't feel familiar, and the answer is, it's an imposter. And the problem with CAPRES, unlike the hyperfamiliarity for faces patients, is that they also have right brain injury, so they can't recognize their error together with their frontal lobe problem, so those delusions become fixed. The patients with hyperfamiliarity for faces don't have frontal injury, don't have right hemisphere lesions, so like that policeman I told you about, you say to him, no, I don't think we've ever met before, and he's like, I'm so sorry, I do, no delusion, just for a moment he gets the feeling of familiarity, but once you explain it, he's perfectly fine. And I think that's the dissociation of what's happening in the two hemispheres. So to summarize, some of the limbic or epilepsy lessons is that, we tend to get locked in a lot of our views of what we think is going on now at this time, like Orrin did with the Fuegians, and I think we're wrong a lot. That how we conceive of epilepsy is pre-ictal, ictal, post-ictal, and interictal is probably not always nearly as discrete and probably much more continuous than people imagine. That the mechanisms that underlie seizures in epilepsy are probably more complicated, involve both excitation and inhibition, as Jackson, Yarros, and Simons wrote about, and that decreased function, like temporal lobe seizures, can cause positive symptoms like automatisms from activation of central pattern generators, as well as hallucinations and deja vu experiences. They're not just activation, they may be inhibition. And that post-ictal states can predict interictal states, and that if we can find and understand the mechanisms better, we'll probably do much better in stopping them. Thank you very much.
That was an absolute banquet, and I'm sure that each of you will want to pick up on a different point, and we don't have 100 hours, so I must restrain myself to as few comments as possible to give plenty of opportunity for discussion. But I'll pick up on just one aspect. Let me first of all remind you what I said at the beginning, which is that Dr. Devinsky is absolutely at the forefront of his field. He's Mr. Epilepsy.
Can't hear you.
He's Mr. Epilepsy's forefront of his field. I'm reminding you.
This is a throwback. You know what he said about the power station? This is the New York Psychoanalytic Institute. They haven't added that extra layer yet. So what I was saying is, remember, he's at the forefront of his field. He's one of the world's leading epileptologists. He's one of the world's leading behavioral neurologists. He's absolutely at the cutting edge. And why I say that is because what I want to say next is pick up on one of the themes of his presentation. One of the many sort of red threads running through it was this theme of familiarity. In German, there's a word, as there are in all languages, there are words that you can't quite translate. In German, there's a word Heimlichkeit. Unheimlichkeit. It's a little bit. Heimlichkeit is a little bit like familiarity. It means literally translated homeliness, but it's got a kind of a warm, familiar, nostalgic sort of feeling about it. Freud's paper on the uncanny is on Unheimlichkeit, which is the opposite. It's like strange and foreign and not heimlich, not cozy and comfortable. When I listened to this presentation, I just felt Heimlichkeit. Oh, because it's nostalgic. Oh, this is wonderful. This is just brilliant. And I just wanted to sort of run up and kiss him and say, this is the kind of presentation that we want here. This is the kind of. I think there might be something wrong with this. This is the kind of scientist that we need. I mean, he describes these rich, complex clinical presentations, individual cases, real human beings, and the old literature, and he's read Bleuler and Kreplin in the original, and he has anecdotes about Captain Fitzroy on the Beagle, and he believes in theory, he's got theories, and all of this. He speaks a lot. He doesn't just give little data blitzes. So why do I feel such nostalgic affection and love for Dr. Devinsky's presentation? It's because he's one of us. That's why I feel this familiarity, because he's like a psychoanalyst. That's the, and I don't mean it in any disrespect to you. I don't know what it feels like to you. But to me, I just recognize this is one of us. This is, the tradition out of which psychoanalysis arose, and that's literally true. So the early psychoanalysts, they were all neurologists, almost all of them. Very few of them were psychiatrists. But in any event, in those days, in many of the European medical schools, the distinction didn't even exist anyway. But Freud, trained in neurology and developed a particular interest in behavioral neurology just before he moved into psychoanalysis. And I really don't think that it's accidental. I think that the whole sort of syndrome method, the single case method, and another thing that made me feel this Heimlichkeit was that he regrets that you can't publish these lovely long sort of case studies anymore. And so that whole way of taking the clinical reality as the starting point of your investigation, and then proceeding from there and building on all of this sort of layers of tradition and knowledge that comes from previous generations and so on. In fact, if I may just quickly digress, one other thing that made me love you was when you said, well, maybe there's been some slippage in our evolutionary progression. And it reminds me of, since I'm speaking German, there was Karl Kraus in the Viennese circle of Freud, who had this wonderful phrase, which was in der Vergangenheit sogar die Zukunft war besser. In the past, even the future was better. And it's also this sort of nostalgic feeling that you evoked to me. But I'm just rambling. I mean, I really want to make an important point, which is this: that in the early days of psychoanalysis, I mean, the early analysts were seeing these kinds of cases that Dr. Devinsky's described. I don't mean only seizure disorder cases, but neurological disorders of various kinds. The whole sort of thing was a matter of taxonomizing and identifying the different types and describing the clinical features. And there wasn't a hell of a lot known about the pathophysiology of these diseases. The only real tools that we had was kind of autopsy. And if there wasn't a big fat lesion there, you didn't really know what had caused the picture during life. But the job was nevertheless to sift out the different types. And In those early days, there were many cases that we now recognize as seizure disorders, and we forget. You're reminding us how recent our species is. I mean, even more recent is the EEG. It's only been around since the 30s in any sort of, only since the war was it really used regularly. And before the EEG, who was to say who had a seizure disorder and who had an hysteria? And if you go back to those early cases, I mean, Dora, I'm very alarmed when I read the case study of Dora with all of her smells and whatnot. And many of Charcot's cases too, many of those early cases, they were studied, and many seizure disorder cases were analyzed in those early days. I mean, even recognized as seizure disorders, they were analyzed. The point being that much of our early psychoanalytical understanding of the mind and how it works, which was framed in this sort of methodology, the single case study, trying to make order out of the chaos of the clinical presentation, trying to infer the sort of underlying basic lawful principles. In the case of a neurologist, you then can ultimately link it to the pathological anatomy, and out of that they built a very sort of solid knowledge base, and as technology has advanced, so it's not just pathological anatomy anymore, now there are all kinds of tools available. And so they've got this brilliant, solid, wonderful field called behavioral neurology, and that's why I remind you he's at the forefront of his field. Despite this nostalgia he evokes in me, he's where it's at. And what's happened to psychoanalysis? It started in the same sort of way, with the same sort of patients, the same sort of method. The problem with psychoanalysis is there wasn't any pathological anatomy, there wasn't any bedrock that you could say, okay, this is right, that's wrong, there's the lesion, and so on. And so it kind of, it kind of kept all of this theorizing and this single caseness and this nostalgia and this waffling and all of that, and this love of the complex clinical reality, but it lacked the serious stamp of science. And that's why there is a dramatic difference between Dr. Devinsky and one of us. Psychoanalysts. But it really needn't be like that, and this is the last thing I'm going to say. It needn't remain like that, because nowadays, as I said earlier, we're not anymore relying upon just what the pathologist finds. There are all kinds of methods available to us. There are all sorts of things that we can know about what's going on in the brains of our patients. And I think that we really don't sufficiently take advantage of that. I mean, for me, this interdiscipline that I've tried to encourage to develop, which we call neuropsychoanalysis, is first and foremost a clinical discipline. It should base itself in this sort of stuff. I've done much psychoanalytical work with patients of the kind that you've described here, and other focal lesion syndromes. It's a fascinating, fascinating world, getting to know the inner life of those patients, where you know something about the neurology, and it really makes that you able to ground your psychoanalytical observations in this lesion caused this, and you get to know certain syndromes, and it's very, very important for us to be able to ground our concepts in anatomy. But also, it can be done the other way around. Now, with the kinds of patients, so-called psychiatric patients, there's so much, the tools that we have at our disposal, there's so much we can learn about their brain function. I think that the dichotomy is now sort of completely artificial. The interectal states that Dr. Devinsky describes in, what is the difference between that fundamentally, in principle, and the whole of psychiatry? What we're dealing with is perturbations, excitations, and inhibitions of different brain systems. What else could there be? That's all that there is, which produces these different behavioral syndromes, and that's what psychiatry is. And now we have the tools to be able to, in fact, correlate the mental side with the physiological and the anatomical, but we're just sort of not quite doing it. So, sorry, I meant to speak much more briefly, but that's sort of what I wanted to say, and I hope that in this impressionistic and very excited little patter, you get the point that I'm wanting to make. And now I'm going to grab that microphone, and please tell me who wants to ask questions. But while I'm doing it, Dr. Devinsky, come up here and answer my question. What do you think is the difference between psychiatry and neurology? Is there no difference anymore?
I don't think there's a difference. I think neurologists who ignore psychological and personality factors are missing a big part of the boat. I think psychiatrists who ignore chemical and anatomical aspects of behavior are missing a big part of the boat. One of my favorite anecdotes is seeing an epilepsy patient who's got, or occasionally another patient who's got significant depression, and saying, you should think about, they're not happy, they're not enjoying social life, they're not doing things. And I say you should think about going on an antidepressant. Oh, no, I don't need to do that. That's not permitted. And I think it's just something bizarre about Western culture, and what I will often say to them is that, listen, if you had Parkinson's disease, and you had a deficiency of a neurotransmitter that's been around in animals since lobsters, called dopamine, and your dopamine level was low in your basal ganglia, and you were hunched over, and you were stiff, and you were shaking, and to get up from a chair took you 5 seconds, and a lot of effort, and I said, I can give you this thing called L-Dopa, and it's going to make you 95% better. I guarantee you 100% you would take the medication, and people do. But if you had a low serotonin level, which is also present in lobsters, and it's present in your amygdala, which is about ½ an inch away from your caudate nucleus in basal ganglia, and it caused you to be sad and hopeless and helpless and think about hurting yourself, and say you should take a medicine that raises serotonin levels, why is it you say, no? It's a bizarre dichotomy, which has nothing to do with the brain and behavior. It has to do with the origins of Western society.
So we'll start with Jörg Benson.
Marvelous. Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me ask you a two-part question. One is more factual, and the other one is looking into the crystal ball. The factual one is when you in lower regions of the brain, things are more genetically determined in functional organization, and the lateral amygdala and therefore the surrounding temporal cortex and the cortical medial amygdala and surrounding temporal cortex seem to, at least at the amygdala level, have very distinct, probably genetically determined functions. Is there enough epileptic data that if you've got a focus in the cortical medial temporal lobe versus basolateral temporal lobe, that these people show any difference in syndrome? That's the first one.
Yeah, in the amygdala, no, we just don't have at this point in science enough information. There were a couple of interesting studies of things like sexual function based on amygdala size and MRIs that we can show correlations, but apart from some studies like that, we know very little about specific areas. It's a great thing, we just haven't studied it yet.
I hope someone does soon and see whether the predictions hold, so to speak. The other is, you focused on cortical specialization, fusiform gyrus, face recognition. We all know these localizations, but at the same time, modern neuroscience is giving us a very dramatic lesson that at birth, the neocortex is fundamentally closer to tabula rasa than any specialization. We all know left hemisphere seizure that leads to total hemispherectomy, so language transports to the right hemisphere. So what image are we supposed to have about why there's such high predictability in the way the neocortex learns its functions, or do you disagree that it learns?
No, I think I agree with everything you said. I think the brain is incredibly plastic. It's plastic at our age for most of the people in this room. It's much more plastic at birth and early on. I think there are a couple points, and without getting into these too much, there's a book called On Intelligence, written by Jeff Hawkins, who of all things is the creator of the Palm Pilot trio. But it's a great look at how the brain learns. And we tend to think about, from von Economode, finding all the different brain areas and Brodmann's areas. One point he makes is what Mountcastle made, is that if you look at the 6-layer cortex, whether it's in the occipital lobe or the frontal lobe or the temporal lobe, yeah, you can get, there's more granular layers in, occipital primary visual and obviously giant pyramidal cells in the primary motor cortex. But apart from some subtle differences, basically the 6 layers are identical. And they're incredibly similar. And what the brain is doing is learning to process input and output and learn patterns. The brain is a pattern learning machine. And yeah, we get pre-programmed to have touch sensation go to our somatosensory cortex. But if you've got no hand and no arm here, that cortex will get taken up by something else. Other portions of innervation, blind people have flex in their occipital lobe and their visual cortex. So it's all plastic, and it can change in adulthood. But I think the brain is basically a pattern learning machine.
What's the, in your image, the cause of the high localization across individuals that eventually emerges?
I think we are pre-programmed. I think, we are derived from primates who were there for tens of millions of years, and the brain just keeps getting, learns to do different things in different areas. It has the plasticity, which is remarkable, despite the stamp of 30 million years of evolution of visual cortex being in the occipital lobe. Take away the eyeballs, and somatosensory invades there. So, despite 30 million years of evolution, it's maintained this incredible plasticity. But having said that, we do have the stamp of 30 and more million years of cortical development in which different areas of the brain have learned to do things. Certainly with the frontal lobes, it's a more abstract thing, holding time in abeyance and seeing ahead, which is hard for almost all other animals to do, which our frontal lobes do beautifully. So I think we are pre-programmed. You can look at, fetal humans and show the left plane of temporality is larger, and it is in some primates as well. So I think there are things we inherit, but they can be changed pretty quickly.
Okay, the next question is from a colleague who I don't know, but who has involved rapid hand putting up slides.
Hi, thank you so much. I wanted to ask in terms of the facial sort of hyper recognition, it seems like it's a pattern of, as well as the recognition of an emotion of warmth and familiarity and belonging, which is followed by one of rejection and alienation. And I'm curious whether there's any kind of snowball effect emotionally over time regardless of the cause of that.
It's a great question. There's so few of these patients described. Some of them it only lasts, as I said, for a couple days. My best patient, or whatever, I don't know, terrible phrase, but best example is that policeman I described, who I still see and I saw about a month ago. I don't think it has had any impact. He's just learned that this is part of life. He sees faces, he feels they're familiar. He tries not to go up to people anymore unless he's really confident he knows exactly who they are. But he still does go up to people. He still does get told, no, I'm not familiar. But psychologically, I think he's a very happy camper and living his life well. So I think it's a very compartmentalized thing within his psychic life. I think he has a good understanding. And luckily, from the beginning, he understood it's got a physical basis. It resulted from the seizures. It's happened in other people with epilepsy. We don't understand it, but it is what it is, and I think he accepts that.
Thank you, Zelda.
Thank you for a great talk. I wanted to ask about, in that cluster of symptoms that tend to show up with temporal lobe epilepsy, there's two dichotomies that were kind of counterintuitive and surprising. So one is tending to be hypoactive and also tending to be irritable and aggressive. So that was interesting that those can travel together. So I was interested in what you think about that. And then the other one is the very interesting dissociation between hyposexuality but increased kind of attachment behaviors, kind of social connectedness, which is part of, some people have been thinking in our community about kind of asking, the questions about different kinds of drives, to what extent does sexual drive overlap with attachment processes or is differentiated? And in these patients, it seems like they're extremely differentiated. So I'd be interested to kind of what you think about that on a brain level.
Right, so the first question is a great one, and actually Gasto, I think, gave us somewhat of an answer, and I think he's probably right. For a lot of these people, they tend to overall be hypoactive, as you said, in their kind of baseline state. But they're a drop like volcanoes, which is what seizures are a drop like. It's almost like then all of a sudden nervous energy gets built up, and then it's got to get released. And it doesn't get released in kind of the normal, regular way that we do it. It kind of sits down here, builds up, and when it goes, like a seizure, as a metaphor, it just like comes out volcanically. And that can be what happens. They can just be sitting around doing nothing, not caring, not doing anything, and some trivial thing irritates them, and they go, they just totally lose it. Geschman, had some great examples of the aggressiveness and irritability. One guy who got to his office 4 hours late, he was leaving, and the guy walks in 4 hours late for an appointment. He was coming from Western Massachusetts, took a bus, was, kind of sleeping on the bus and got awoken by cigarette smoke, which was a driver. And at that point, he's not supposed to be driving the driver. He's smoking the driver, even back in those days for drivers. And so the guy walked up and said, "You have to put out the cigarette." And the guy basically said, "Shut up, buddy, go back to your seat." And he went back to his seat, and 2 minutes later got up again. And this is a guy who's very passive, very meek. And the bottom line is the bus driver pulled the bus over on the Mass Pike. They got in a brief fist fight. The guy got arrested. And eventually made it to Geshman's office 4 hours later. But that's kind of this guy. He's kind of very placid, doesn't do anything, but that social injustice, moralistic thing just set him off the edge and ended up getting into a fight, getting arrested. Eventually got released because of calls and things to people with his epilepsy. But just that kind of volcanic image. And then for the second part of your question, I mean, I do think they're dissociable, and I think this is a great example that the sexual drive and affiliative bonding drives are probably quite different. I think, sexuality probably has a much more reproductive, hypothalamic, testosterone activate. You give a male a large dose of testosterone, and you're going to increase sexual drive dramatically. I don't think, the male athletes who are using testosterone who get into fights and may describe marked increase in sexual interest. They don't describe, I want to spend more time with my family, it's such a warm experience. That's not happening. So I think testosterone, in these cases, there's a lot of good examples. And I think you can show that you can stimulate certain portions of the brain and get dramatic sexual things. And like I described in the lateral versus medial septal lesions in mice, you can show dramatic differences in what's described as affiliative behavior among animals. So I think they probably are different brain systems and they're very dissociable.
Next question is here. Oh, wait, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Next question is here.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Michaela, and I am a bit in the roundabout that Dr. Soms was talking about because I'm a psychiatrist that was formed in Switzerland with a psychoanalytic background, and now I'm doing research at Mount Sinai, and I'm working with phonoeconomal neurons, and I saw that you like very much on Alvin's work, so I just wanted to know your thoughts with the possible role of the phonoeconomal neurons in this theory that you have.
Right, so von Economo neurons, for people who don't know about them, were described by von Economo, who described, the most beautiful architectonics of the cortex that's ever been described at the turn of the 20th century. And what these are very large spindle-shaped neurons that have long cell bodies, very distinctive, and occur in only a few areas of the brain, in the anterior cingulate cortex and the frontal opercular insula. So really just a couple regions of the brain have this. Of course, they were thought to be present only in humans once they were described, and have subsequently been found in great apes, but not in lower primates.
Hippopotamus, elephants.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So cetaceans' brains, which have not been looked at terribly carefully and are a little bit different than ours. They have a lot more brain than we do, but it's a little thinner, the cortex. They also have von Economo neurons in almost identically the same spots. So I must say at the beginning, I have a little bit of skepticism. There's only a few people who describe von Economo neurons. I'm sure your colleague at Mount Sinai and Dr. Allman, who I love, and I think they're both phenomenal neuroscientists. It seems remarkable to me that cetaceans, which I think branched off from mammals 55 million years ago or so, give or take, ended up, obviously through divergent or homologous evolution, came up with the same neurons in the exact same spot, living in totally different portions. So, my fear is we haven't sampled enough brain regions from enough diverse species to look for these. But they're thought to be important in social judgments. Again, I think Allman's hypothesis there is just not based on enough data. So I'm fascinated by von Economo neurons. I've read everything I can read about them, and I'm left unsatisfied by the amount of data. I think we need a lot more information before we start speculating what they do. There's no doubt they probably play some very interesting and important synthetic role in brain function. I'm just not smart enough to know what they are, and I'm not sure that the people writing about them, but I know the articles from Lori Marino down at Emory with your colleague at Sinai and the other ones on elephants as well. So all these big-brained animals have these von Economode neurons, but they had to all evolve separately in cetaceans, whales, and dolphins, in elephants, which have their own route of evolution, and in primates. So it's remarkable that every one of the big brain has von Economode neurons. I'm just curious where they came and what their functions are. They're fascinating, and I wait to hear the rest of the story.
Thank you. This is very impressive and wonderful. At the same time, I do have some skepticism based on experience I've had with patients in state hospitals where a lot of these kinds of behaviors are present. And skepticism is that we did look for temporal lobe epilepsy, including to the point of, not a lot of them, but having the Halter EEGs. And we never were able to get data that supported the idea of the TLE in these patients. And I know how hard it is, how difficult it is. I've had private patients who I thought had that and they couldn't find it. So how can you be so sure that your TLEs are actually TLEs?
Well, it's easy for us now. I think, I see a selective population. So I do know, I came from Boston, as I said, and continue to have a lot of good friends and colleagues. And I know that, quite honestly, a lot of my neurologic colleagues sound just like you, that they're frustrated that these psychiatrists are diagnosing temporal lobe epilepsy based on behavioral features with zero EEG evidence, and indeed with a lot of EEG evidence that is negative. And I'll tell you the most embarrassing thing, or the weirdest thing I ever did, there's a JAMA article that I'm the discussant for, this big 5-page case history in JAMA of a guy who, he's fairly public, but obviously his name's not mentioned, but, make a long story short, he was a medical student in Boston, tried to commit suicide, and both he and his epilepsy neurologist are heavily invested in the fact that he has temporal lobe epilepsy. I got to review mounds of charts and data on this guy, and I don't believe, I actually discussed the case, and I didn't want to rock the waters or do anything crazy, but here I am as a discussant showing pictures of the temporal lobe in JAMA. You can look up the article. I don't believe that. I just couldn't say it, and it would have been too awkward and weird. So I used it as an opportunity to talk about temporal lobe epilepsy, as opposed to comment on the diagnosis that had been made decades before I got there. But I think that it does get overdiagnosed because of the behavioral traits. And the problem is, like I try to make that point very strongly, all those behavioral traits can be seen from, paroxysmal phenomena can be seen in affective disorders as much as temporal lobe epilepsy. The interictal stuff you can see in MS, you can see it in Alzheimer's, you can see it in schizophrenia, you can see it in affective disorder. But show me a few, like I said too, show me someone who's got hypermoralistic concerns, who has a history of aggressive behavior, who has diaries that are this tall off the floor, and then I'll start getting my money out and putting some money on the table. But you show me someone who's, hyposexual, who's obsessional, those are just non-specific. That means nothing.
Next question's here.
I have 2 comments and then a question. There is a Russell Monroe. Do you know the name Russell Monroe?
I don't.
A psychiatrist. He wrote a book called Episodic Behavioral Disorders, I believe. In
Oh yeah, I do know it, yeah.
He did some very interesting work, and one of the things that he found a way to sensitize the EEG and did some pre-tests of people in a therapy clinic and found that all of these people coming for usual kinds of complaints in a therapy clinic had abnormal EEGs. And when they went through psychotherapy and the complaints were gone and they were able to deal with their feelings and those of others, etc., they did post-test, no abnormal EEG. I thought that was a very interesting finding. I don't know if there's been any follow-ups.
I don't think that, there's so many wonderful observations like that. One of my favorite ones was Heath, who's a neurosurgeon in New Orleans, who implanted depth electrodes into people with primary schizophrenia back in the late 50s and found septal spiking. Was it real or was it not? But it's an incredibly intriguing finding. No one is going to be putting depth electrodes into idiopathic schizophrenic individuals in today's world, but it just, you get these findings that are hard to know, but I think we should keep an open mind and maybe some avenue for the future.
So then this is a quick case and maybe an impossible question, which is many years ago I was working in the therapeutic community, and there was a young man who, in this therapeutic community we had initially in the morning, every morning, very large group therapy. So you can imagine lots of feelings, lots of stimulation, arguments, everything. And when there would be a lot of excitation, he would have tremendous outbursts. Now, he was then referred to me to work with him clinically. And it turned out, prior to coming to our program, he had, it was found that he had grand mal seizures, so he was taking medication, et cetera. And I worked with him therapeutically, analytically, and when he left, he was very appropriate, could handle all of his feelings, no outbursts, etc. And it just happened prior to his discharge that there was another EEG done, and it was now normal. His behavior had changed, and now his EEG had changed. So my question has always been, what might have been the neurological changes? I know what happened clinically, what I did with him, but what might have happened neurologically?
It's so, it's very hard to know. With individual cases, you have to worry, you need a large series to know what's the random variation, because I see patients and sometimes their EEG is very abnormal, and 3 months later it's normal, and I didn't change meds, and their life hasn't changed. There are other instances of something called forced normalization described in the late 50s by Landau, where patients who had terribly active EEGs but were behaviorally normal and had occasional absence or other seizures got put on an effective medication which normalized their EEG, and then the patient became psychotic. So these things go both ways, which is, again, the EEG, what do you do for someone with terrible depression when they fail every drug? You give them a seizure. And so sometimes in our epilepsy patients, we control the seizures with medications only to lead to the emergence of psychopathology. And sometimes it goes the other way too. It's incredibly fascinating. I think the exact mechanisms and why one group of patients go that way with more seizures and the other group goes the other way is complex. But they're all individual cases, and I think we have not done a good enough job to begin to dig into what's going on mechanistically.
Next question is Dr. Nunberg here.
Yes, thank you for your absolutely fascinating presentation. I have a question about cause and effect. When you describe, for instance, the policeman, and he has the seizures, and after the seizures he has these recognition issues. Now you talked about discrete versus continuous. If you think about this disease as continuous and with outbursts, why is it, or can you have some way of discussing why these things occur only after the seizures? Do the seizures stimulate some further process, or how do you put those together?
I'll be honest, I think about the policeman a lot because ultimately I have no idea what's going on. It just doesn't make sense from my understanding of the brain and neurophysiology that you get a single seizure and then you get left with this dramatic change for 2 years. I mean, if I had to throw my penny in the pot and guess, it's that somehow during the seizure, an avenue of connections just got built that never got erased between the face area and the ability to see things as novel was either burnt out, so he lost the part of his periorhinal cortex which says that's a novel face. Was literally disabled by that seizure, and he never fully recovered that function. And as a result of that, every time he sees a novel face, that area doesn't activate, so it defaults to the familiar mode. Something like that, is my best guess, but I have to be very humble and say I really have no idea what happened.
Let me ask you one follow-up question.
Would that explain why some of these phenomena would disappear with ablation surgery?
Yeah, I do think, so for example, the pin man, the safety pin man, definitely that behavior was some visual limbic connection. He saw a safety pin, he recognized the safety pin, it went right to wherever that was, the amygdala or somewhere in his brain that stimulated sexual thoughts to the point of a seizure with orgasm, and you take out the amygdala and the connections, the circuit's not there in a safety pin. He knows it's a safety pin, but it doesn't do anything for him. So I think the ablations can clearly work in some of those cases.
Yeah, next question.
This is a question about the connection between extension between epilepsy and religion. There's a lot of talk about the phrase, I think Ramachandra mentioned it, the God part of the brain.
Right.
There's a number of books dealing with it from more of an evolutionary biology standpoint that you talked about a little bit. There's Nicholas Wade on the evolution of faith came out. There's Robert Wright's The Evolution of God. There's Ramachandra talking about the God part. Ian Hammer's The God Gene. Could you say this is speculative from your standpoint? In other words, you talk about the connection between epilepsy and temporal lobe, seizures and religious feelings, which is kind of like well known. To what extent do you think that there, from an evolutionary biological standpoint, there is possibly known as the God part of the brain that gives rise to a lot of the origin of religion?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any question, when you take a step back and look at every hunter-gatherer group we've ever found, that religion, something that fits in the religion box is present in every group of modern humans we've ever identified. So when you see things like that present in every group, like Darwin said about smiling and laughing and blushing, you have to think in some way there's some evolutionary hardwiring to it. What that is and how to explain it, I don't think we know. Certainly, the temporal lobe can give rise to incredible experiential phenomena, from the more garden variety ones that we all know, like a sexual experience. Religious experiences, as William James wrote in his last book, Variety of Religious Experiences, there's a common type, people go to church or synagogue or and sit there and have a good feeling as they listen to their priest or their rabbi talk and hear the same prayers that they've heard since childhood. And that's the religion of the common masses. And then there's the religious experiences, which are these incredibly intense phenomena that are described very, very similarly. Whether it's an Indian who's doing a sun dance or a starvation quest, vision quest on their own, to an ayahuasca experience in South America, to religious individuals in multiple groups who have had an experience with God, they describe it like Dostoevsky, and James says, they're fundamentally, dramatically different than the general population average religious phenomena. People who experience those things describe them as much more real, much more intense, like our world in our daily life is a shadow of what the intensity of the real experience of world can be, of the religious world, or the feeling of oneness. And then I think it's just a question of which culture you're born into, of how those people who have had those experiences help translate it to their culture mates. So I think those experiences, the potential for those experiences, like an out-of-body experience, you get enough people with cardiac arrest, you get out-of-body experiences in a significant percentage of them, whether they're 20-year-old pilots or 90-year-olds with cardiac arrest. You get out-of-body experiences. Those are, again, in the category of, they're not exactly, but they overlap with the other religious experiences of what prophets describe. So it's in our brain under times of extraordinary stress, or pathological states like psychiatric disorders, post-ictal states after seizures, or occasionally during an ictal state. So I think there is a part of our brain that can have these experiences, and then depending on which culture you're in is how it gets translated.
Next question here at the back.
Hi. In the spirit of expanding the definition, could you just say something about the idea of orgasm and seizure?
Yeah, I think it's a very rare thing. Number one, for orgasms to result from seizures. Having said that, there are paroxysmal, hardwired neurologic systems that do different things. Orgasm is clearly, a hardwired set of neurologic relationships that start in the brain and end up in the sacrospinal cord and activate, parts of our genitalia. I think that's a hardwired thing, and it has a very paroxysmal nature to it. There's a build-up, a climax, and it ends. And so it does have, you know, if you map it on a graph, it would look like the distribution of neural activity during a seizure in part. But I think it's just a pre-programmed, you know, like those central pattern generators. You can stimulate, and you can get a giggle out of a monkey. You can get a chewing movement out of a human if you stimulate. In the same way, you can stimulate areas of the brain that give you pre-programmed aggressive responses. You can get a cat to go after a mouse and bite it specifically in the nape of the neck by stimulating a tiny area of the hypothalamus. It's a pre-programmed, you know, paroxysmal response, and I think orgasm is no different. Different, but similar. Shouldn't be biting on the back of the neck. Unless the partner asks me.
So it looks like we're reaching the end. I say again, that was an absolute banquet.
Really, intellectual treat. Thank you so much, Dr. One thing that Dr. Devinsky said, which I just want to correct before we go, it's not pathological to be attracted to safety pins. Some of my best friends are.
I got some if anyone needs.
The next meeting is what date?
March 6th.
March 6th. See you all March 6th. It's Heather Berlin on unconscious processes. Thank you all. Bye-bye.